Welcome to the Bros of Gardening. I'm Mike Westphal, your host with my co-host, Daniel Van Dyke. Of course, as always, how you doing today?
I'm good, buddy. How are you doing?
Doing good. So we've also got Alex, of course, our producer here to help guide us and keep us in line during this conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about troubleshooting in the garden. So it's going to be kind of a cool conversation to kind of talk about, how to deal with issues, or what you might see in the garden and how to prevent some of them maybe. So,
Right.
Alex, I'll kind of give it over to you to kind of get us started.
All right. So how does someone deal with an unexpected late frost?
Yeah, I mean, frosts are tough, and everybody's got a different area and a different scenario that they're going to be in. So, what you got, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is what you've got to figure out is, like you said, everybody's got a different environment. And so frosts are the right climate for a frost is what you're really going to have to take a look out for. So if you can see a frost coming, you can take some steps to prevent it. But a lot of time it's just, kind of trying to be conscientious. Again, we talk about the timing of the year and different things to do when it's colder. And so that's why you don't see a lot of your 6-inch annuals and stuff like that out too early because of those frost dates.
Right.
So the first recommendation would be pay attention to the frost date. I mean, it is a frost date for a reason. But if you do see the frost coming, I've always said you can use mulch. You can try to protect your plant material. They do make different like frost cloths, and really what you're just trying to do is kind of insulate and protect that material.
Right.
Again, I think the conditions for frost, we got to have. It's got to be clear. You can probably speak to it better than I can, but it's clear skies.
Clear skies, no wind, and 40 degrees or below. So that's kind of what you're looking out for. And you're right. I mean, the frost dates, you can do a Google search. In our neck of the woods, here in the Hampton Roads area and the, Virginia Beach area, it's an easy 2 dates to remember. There's 2 different frost times that you got to be prepared for. So there's one in spring, where your last frost could be, and then there's one in the fall where your first frost could be.
Right.
So here in our area, it's easy days. It's April 15th, which of course is tax day, and November 15th, which is roughly about election time frame. So those are 2 easy dates for us to remember. But what I'll always tell people is look at your 10-day forecast when you're getting close to those frost dates and kind of see what kind of state you're going to be in. And you're right, that you've got to have all 3 of those things line up. It's got to be 40 degrees or lower. Then it's got to be no wind, and then it's got to be clear skies. So if it's slightly cloudy, you won't have a frost. If you got a little, 5 to 10 mile per hour wind, no frost.
Yeah.
So and basically what a frost is the small water molecules in the air freeze, and because they freeze, they fall down to the lower portion of the ground and land on plants, and then that can harm tender plant material. And so it's really kind of planning for that and being a little bit careful. You're right. You won't see certain plants in, I'd say locally owned or independent garden centers. You typically won't see plants that we don't feel comfortable with you planting at that point. A lot of times we'll put out frost date signs so people know kind of roughly that time frame. And we just want, customers and shoppers to be prepared for what we can't control.
Right.
which is a frost.
Well, and I think the other part of it too is, yes, frost, obviously, and this time of year we can have, I think we were having 70-degree weather and stuff like that, and so, but at the same time, we can get that frost date that comes along. And like you said, it's the tender material. So if you get kind of a quick warm up in the spring, some of your evergreen shrubs and things like that may push some new growth. Yep. But then if we get a cold snap and we get some of those frosts, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to burn.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the plant is going to die. A lot of times it might just mean pruning it off. Then once that warm weather comes back, you'll hit another flush. So while it can be frustrating, you see all this beautiful new growth, it might burn a little bit. But the frost isn't going to be detrimental to most things. And that's why, like you said, we don't put things out that are going to die when they get that frost burn.
Right.
So that way we kind of wait for those things. And so while the frost can be frustrating, at the same time, if it burns a little bit of the tender material, stuff with new growth, don't panic. Your whole entire shrub's not going to die. Your plant's not going to die. It's just going to, maybe a little bit of pruning, maybe cut it back a little bit if you don't like the look of it, and then kind of let it flush back out once it warms back up for the spring.
Yeah, I mean, your last frost date, so in the spring season typically, is the one that you're going to want to pay the most attention to, because that kind of says, okay, we're past this date. Now I can go and do a bunch of things. I can go and plant and start thinking about my vegetable garden. I can start planting some of those tender annuals. The first frost in the fall isn't as important. It's typically how long are my annuals going to make it.
The opposite, yeah.
So it's not as important, but it's still good to know those dates because it does kind of, especially in like vegetable gardening, I think people always are concerned about their frost dates. It really helps with like when you're seeding and different types of things when it comes to that. So I think a couple things that you can do to be preventative is, you mentioned quickly, covering. So covering can be done. There is a specific product. It's a frost cloth that you can buy. Most garden centers probably carry a small portion of it. You can order probably large rolls of it if you need to online. But basically what it is a very light material that protects your plants from the frost because it covers them and the frost falls on the blanket and therefore it doesn't get onto the plants. So there's ways of doing that. If you've got greenhouses, some people have small greenhouses they can protect some of their plants in. And so that's helpful. And I think mulch is probably one of my favorites. Mulch keeps your temperature consistent. Now, it's not going to protect the top of the plant. Right. So if we have a hard frost and you've got tender plants out there that you've planted, at least the root system is protected with the mulch. The top, like you mentioned, Daniel, you can always do a little bit of trimming on to bring it back.
Well, and again, we've talked about container gardening and stuff like that too, and that is one of the advantages if you do go with container gardening is you can pull the containers up tight to the house and get them a little bit more protected, or even pull them into the garage if you're really worried about it and things like that. Same concept. You're just trying to protect that material. It's not necessarily the cold weather, but it is that frost and stuff like that. So, anyway, like I said, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I wouldn't be overly alarmed. Just pay attention to your frost date, and that's really all you can do, and just kind of in preparation for it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Let's see. What is the best way to manage overly wet soil and drainage issues?
Well, this is right up your alley.
Yeah. So we have two different approaches. Obviously, in the Tidewater area, we have a lot of low-lying areas and waterfront areas that deal with wet soils. And then a lot of times people, any number of people have had low spots and drainage issues in their yard. And so there's really two different ways that we look at attacking it. The first way when just managing the soil, which Mike, plenty about as well, is just, amending that soil. You can do different things to try to help with the drainage of your soil, adding in perlite, adding in soil perfector. For really, really, really wet soils, we've even planted with rock in the bottom of the hole to lift those roots up out of the soil. So there's kind of a little reservoir basin that the water, so it's not just constantly sitting in. So there's different things that you can do to try to combat wet soils.
For sure.
I would say the biggest one, adding in a lot of that organic matter, and then again, perlite, vermiculite, all those types of things.
Yep.
Obviously, it's kind of the same concept of the benefits of sandy soil. You're kind of trying to recreate a lot of those benefits. But as for actual drainage issues, and I'll try not to go on for too long, but
it's okay.
So the number one issue that we find with drainage is a lot of times, if you have your yard, you have your lot, and you put a big house in the middle of it, or a house, and essentially all the rain that falls on that house is going to either spill over if you have a gutter system, through the downspouts, or it's going to come right off the roof line. And so what you're doing is you're putting anywhere from 1,000, 2,000 square feet of water and throwing it all in one spot.
Yep.
And so you're creating a wet spot, essentially.
Right. Yep.
So there's different ways to combat that. So the first way we always start trying to tackle a drainage issue is by controlling the water flow where we can. So if you have a downspout, it's piping that downspout out.
Right.
It can be just basically trying to get that water where it's supposed to go. Usually the water is supposed to grade on a lot towards one area.
Right.
It could be through the city sewer system. It could be a water reservoir in the back. There's a lot of different options, but essentially you want to get the water away from your house and have it, a steady kind of sheet drain of water through the yard. And so again, there's different ways to do that. The number one, I always suggest starting with the downspout. Start with the water collection off the house, because a lot of times that is a big issue. And then from there, you can, go through, if you have a low spot in the yard, you can just start to try to play with it with getting some topsoil in there. A lot of times you put some topsoil in one spot, the water moves to the next spot. So it's kind of like a trial and error. Don't get frustrated with it. And eventually, you can kind of not regrade your entire yard, but you kind of start to pick and choose your low spots. If you have a really low spot and there's no way to get the water out of there, one of my favorite things to do is embrace it and do a rain garden.
Love it.
A rain garden is a really good way to deal with it. You got to be selective and you can prep it different ways, but we've had plenty of places where they have a low-lying area. There's nowhere to take the water, so we embrace that. We push all the water towards that area, and then you create a rain garden. So you have a beautiful garden that is good for, you can put different things
Pretty
in
self-sustaining.
there. Yeah, self-sustaining. And so a rain garden is a way that we will embrace those kind of wet areas when you have a really, really wet spot and there's nowhere to take that water. And then another thing, getting a little bit more of a landscape design side of things is like dry riverbeds. That's one of my favorite things to do. I'll put a dry riverbed even in when you don't need a dry riverbed, just because aesthetically
it looks cool.
Yeah, you've heard me talk about rock and stuff like that, and so I'm a big proponent of rock and mixing in different textures. So if you kind of have this meandering dry riverbed running through your landscape, you can run it off the downspouts, you can run it down property lines, you can do different things with it, and it's just a really cool aesthetic choice. But it can also be extremely functional. I mean, that's how we started using them. Was customers didn't want to put black pipe running through their yard. They just wanted to have a natural way. And so you can kind of grade everything towards this kind of, if you picture a canal, but it's not that exaggerated, but you kind of just funnel everything towards this stream bed of sorts. But again, I call it a dry riverbed because 9 times out of 10, there is no water in it. But when you do get that hard rain, that water can funnel into that. It runs through the rock, so you don't have standing water. You don't have to worry about bugs and mosquitoes. And that water kind of just sheet drains through there. And again, it just gives you, what you're trying to do is create an area to push that water towards. So as far as dealing with drainage issues, that's kind of my drainage 101 is control the water where you can, and then step back and see what you got. So step 1 would be controlling your downspouts or having your low-lying areas and trying to deal with those independently of some of the other stuff.
Yeah, I think Daniel just answered, pretty much that whole question. The only thing that I would add in there is what he said about amendments. The soil's really, really wet and you're planting in that specific spot, adding a lot more perlite, I think, is probably my number 1 recommendation. You can also plant things high. That would be the only other thing that I think I could add is, there are plants that have taught us that some of them like to be planted high. So like, for example, Daphne, rhododendrons. Rhododendrons grow in the mountains. So you think of a mountain, it gets its water when it comes down the mountain and then it goes away. So it likes to get the water and then it likes it to go away. So you can kind of plant plants on their own little mountain, which means you could plant the root ball like half in, half out. And you don't want to keep that half that's out exposed. So you just take a little bit of excess soil and just grade it up to the side so it sits up on this own little hill. And that will actually help in wet areas because typically those top roots are the ones that are going to want to dry out the fastest.
Gotcha.
So if you've got really, really wet soil, picking plants that I think work in wet soil is a great option, but you could also try planting a little high. So that'd be the only thing I think I'd add.
Gotcha.
And I think that's a great point, just to piggyback off of that. Sorry, Alex. But just, even just with things, obviously there are certain plants like Mike mentioned that really prefer to be planted high, but just a rule of thumb in general is plant a little high, because a lot of times if you dig the hole, you have that loose soil, it can settle a little bit. So if you aim for level to even a little low, and then in that soil settles some, and you end up with a depression around the root ball, nothing wants to be truly like underwater like that. Some things can take it, some things won't mind it. But if a general rule of thumb is, I always try to tell, when we're training people on the crew and things like that, for best planting practices, we always aim for about at least a half an inch to an inch out of the ground for that root ball. And then like Mike was saying, you just bring that soil level up to the edges of the root ball so they don't dry out. You don't want to pack any soil on top of the roots. You just want to bring it up right to the edge of that existing root ball. But this is just a good thing to remember in general, whether you are planting in a wet area or just planting in a normal area, just kind of get in the habit of planting a little high, or if you're in a wet area, give me exaggerating that up a little bit and planting it even higher. But it's a good point. Just to piggyback off of that.
I did want to touch back real quick on some landscaping. So if somebody wanted to pipe the downspouts out, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, so it's a pretty easy concept. Again, I think the hardest part is usually what that consists of is if you have downspouts, if you have a gutter system and you have a downspout, you might have 2 or 3 on the corners of the house where all that water is going to daylight, and that's where the output of the gutter system is going to be. So if you you can just get some, what we recommend using is just a 4-inch corrugated pipe. You basically find a good place to daylight that water. And what I mean by daylight is that's basically just to dump the water. And so that might be when you get to the crest of your backyard where it starts to slope downhill. And once that, the best thing for drainage is gravity. So what you're trying to find is where gravity is going to take over and naturally take that water away for you. But you want to get it away from the house too. You don't want the water sitting right up against the foundation. So what we recommend is you find the hardest part is probably trying to find where you want to take the water to.
Right.
Yeah.
But once you find that out, essentially you just dig about an 8-inch deep trench. You don't want to dig it really deep in the ground. You want it to be just an inch or two below that soil level. You're going to hook up your corrugated pipe. If you go, some local garden centers may have it, but some of your local hardware stores and stuff will have it too. You get, downspout adapters. They'll have everything that kind of hooks together into that corrugated pipe. You run it out where you want to go, and then you can either just daylight it and dump it. They have pop-up adapters and different ways to kind of disperse that water. It's a pretty easy system to use, and it's very effective. And again, the big thing is you're getting the water away from your house, and you're not creating just one big wet spot, that's going to cause you issues. And so that's the big thing, I think, is just trying to find where nature's going to take over and you're going to have that natural fall. And once you find that, then you're, like Mike was saying, on the side of a mountain, you're not going to have, gravity's going to win. And so if you can find that low-lying area and get that water out of there to a place that has good drainage and good fall, that's all you're trying to do.
Gotcha. Thank you. So what would you say is the best way to prevent transplant shock for young plants?
Oh, yeah. I mean, certainly, that is a big issue, I think, especially for beginner gardeners that aren't quite sure what to do. And you might go and look up like older videos or ideas of like, I always love the slicing of the root ball. I mean, that used to be, I think when Daniel and I first started, it was almost kind of at that time kind of phasing out. So it's older than 20 years for sure, where it was take a knife and slice the side of the root ball up. And that was to hopefully generate new root growth, which would help the plant establish faster, but it's been determined that that's actually not good for it. So we just talk about roughing it up, just taking, I usually take like a stick or I find a pine cone or something just to kind of rough up the sides of the root ball to kind of get your roots flared out. Because the idea is you don't want to take a plant out of its pot and plant it right in the soil because the roots don't know that it's in a new home and then it can expand its roots out. So you got to flare some of those roots out so that it's actually going to dig into the soil. Otherwise, those roots could just spin and spin and spin and eventually choke itself out. So that's not necessarily transplant shock, but if you do slice up your root ball, that's not going to help. I think Biotone is probably my all-time favorite product for getting roots generated, getting a plant to kind of deal with that transplant shock. So what is transplant shock? I guess we could start there. Sure. It's living in a home. It's in its home. It's been grown in that home environment for a very, very long time. And so it loves this pot. It loves the soil. It loves the water that it's getting, the nutrients that you're feeding it. And then all of a sudden you take it out of its home environment and you put it in a new home and it's shocked.
Yeah.
So it's how do you take that shock off of it? And Biotone has just got beneficial bacteria and mycorrhizae and all these different things that kind of help kind of generate root growth. So they form a symbiotic relationship with the root system that lasts for the life of the plant, really. And so they pull things away from the plant that the plant doesn't want and they give things back that the plant does want. So Biotone is a great, safe, light formula that I absolutely love. And I think that really helps with transplant shock.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, Mike actually is the one that turned me on to Biotone, and we've started using it, and we saw the effects of it. What I like about it is it's safe to use. Like, it's a light formula, so you don't have to worry about really what you're using it on, which just makes it easier. It's one product that you can use, and you can use it across different types of material. So yeah, Mike turned me on to Biotone, and I haven't looked back since. So that would be the big thing. And again, I to go back to some things I've talked about is just amending the soil in general. Like Mike said, what you're doing is you're taking that plant out of its home that it's grown in, it's been comfortable in. It's obviously cared for, gets watered regularly. It's under irrigation a lot of times, and you're putting it into the yard a lot of time into the environment, whether that's the heat, the cold. It's going to be a little bit more of a severe environment a lot of times. And so really what you're trying to do is make that transition, that acclimation period as easy as possible. And so I think by amending the soil, giving it a home, digging the root ball the right size, we always say, trying to, dig the root ball at least 2 to 3 times the size, dig the hole rather 2 to 3 times the size of the existing root ball. Because what you're trying to do is get that amended soil, some of that loose soil to, like Mike was saying, when you rough up that root ball, what we're really trying to do is just encourage root growth into the existing soils and get that plant to get established so it can be more self-sufficient. And just having that is going to help with the transplant shock as well. But at the same time, kind of on the adverse side of that is also your timing. We talked about the frost date earlier. While yes, it can be, not so beneficial when it's colder, but sometimes cold weather can be a perfect time if you're truly transplanting, something that you have in your yard that you're going to move around. It might not necessarily be a new plant that you just bought, but maybe you want to rearrange some things and you're going to dig it up and move it over. Well, when it's cold outside in the wintertime, things are dormant. That's a perfect time to transplant.
Yep.
You can still do it in the spring. You can do it in the fall. You may try to avoid doing actual transplanting in the summer,
right,
because you are going to be digging and cutting some of those roots inevitably. So I think just paying attention to it and then just making sure it has plenty of water and stuff like that, just to try to, again, make that first couple weeks after you plant as easy as possible and as stress-free as possible. It's going to be stressed out enough, as it is. So just whatever you can do to kind of reduce that amount of stress is probably going to be the best case for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. I literally am like so retail centric that I'm like, transplant shock is going from a pot to the ground. But yeah, you're right. I mean, moving plants around in your yard, I mean, that is certainly going to cause a shock, because when you move a plant, you are going to cut through roots and you're going to damage that root system. It's just inevitable. You have to do it. Now, you're going to try and get as much of it as you possibly can, but when you do move them, you're going to cut some. So it's timing is really important, and kind of goes hand in hand with planting. Specifically trees and shrubs, we'll always recommend fall is the best time, but your best selection's typically going to be in the spring. So, a little bit contradictory there, but, it's timing. And then I'll say with transplanting and with, whether you're going from a pot to the ground or going from one spot in your yard to another spot, Super Thrive is like my all-time favorite product. It is awesome. It is not a plant food. It is a vitamin supplement, and basically it just takes the shock off of plants. Hence what we're talking about, transplant shock. So Super Thrive is my all-time go-to, because what it is it's not a food. And I think a lot of times when people see a plant struggling, they say it must need to be fed, which sometimes it is. I'm not saying it's not, but sometimes if it's struggling for unknown reasons, I've had it for many, many years, or I've been feeding it and it's not working, then Super Thrive really, really helps, because it just takes that shock, whatever that plant's going through, and kind of shakes it loose of that and allows it to kind of, go free again. A lot of bonsai growers use Super Thrive because bonsais are constantly kind of stressed out, shocked plants, because they're these bigger plants in these tiny little pots and their roots are being cut fairly often. So Super Thrive is kind of my go-to. And then my last thing that I'd add is don't baby your plants. We're not going to get super deep into watering regimens, but when you water a plant in the ground, once you've planted it, if you're watering it every single morning, like maybe you think you're supposed to, then that root system is going to expect to get it every single morning.
And then all of it's not going to grow out and start looking for water.
Yeah, exactly.
So then all of a sudden you're like, you know what? I've been watering this thing for 3 weeks. I'm done. And then the plant's like, what happened? I didn't go searching for water so that's what you want to do, is push your plants a little bit to search for water. They're grown to survive. They're survivors. Plants have been around longer than we have. So they're definitely survivors. So, push them to kind of search for water. And that way they'll dig in and dig a little bit deeper, and you'll be better off for it.
That's a great point.
Yeah. I think that's it for me. What about you guys? Any other tips?
No, I think, again, just going back to transplanting a little bit, when I think of transplant shock in the actual landscape arena, I'm thinking of, Mike alluded to it, you're going to inevitably cut those roots, but you do want to try to cut and get as big a root ball as possible. So any tips as far as transplanting and moving stuff, get as big a root ball as you can handle. And then like Mike said, Super Thrive, that's another one that Mike turned me on to that I wasn't familiar with. We were having some issues with different things, and I came to Mike and he said, Super Thrive, Biotone, and like I said, now it's standard practice for us, especially when we're doing transplants. And so I think all that's great advice, and just again, do what you can, but like Mike said, let those plants dry out a little bit and try to get them to search for some water, because a lot of times people will overdo it with the water, and then all of a sudden the plant's not ready, because they'll water it through spring and then the summer heat hits and they think they're done, and that's pretty much the worst possible timing and combination. So it's a great point as well.
Yeah, and I think, just in general, if you're having trouble in your garden, like we've said multiple times on this podcast, is talk to your local garden centers.
Yes,
They're going to have the answers for you. We only touched on 3, but 3 of, I think, the very, very important topics. Drainage is a huge problem and very difficult for a lot of people to understand. I certainly don't know how to move water as well as you do, Daniel. But some of these things are really, really important. And certainly if you've got more questions, or topics that you want us to talk about in the future, definitely let us know.
Yeah.
You can drop a line on our YouTube channel in the comments, or wherever you see us. us, go onto our website. And thank you for joining us. And thanks, guys. This was a great
Absolutely.
discussion.
Yeah.
All
Absolutely.
right. Next week, we're going to be talking about fighting disease and pests in the garden. And we'll get into that topic next week. So we'll see you then.